Today in the Daily Dose, the Progressive Era. Grover Cleveland. Born in 1837 Caldwell, New Jersey, Grover Cleveland dropped out of school at 16 after his father died in 1853, working as a teacher for the New York Institute for the Blind to help support his 8 brothers and sisters. Passing the New York bar exam in 1859, without attending law school, Cleveland opened his own law firm in 1862, avoiding conscription into the Civil War by paying a Polish immigrant to serve in his place. Elected sheriff of Erie County, New York in 1871, a decade later he became mayor of Buffalo, New York in 1882, followed by his election as New York State governor in 1883 due to his growing reputation as an anti-corruption politician, which soon put him at odds with the powerful Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. Despite a paternity scandal where he admittedly paid child support to a woman who claimed he was the father of her child, Cleveland won the White House in 1884 with the support of crossover Republican mugwumps. Cleveland based his political appointments on merit rather than party affiliation, using his presidential veto power 414 times during his first term, more times than all preceding U.S. presidents combined, in an attempt to curb government spending at the federal level. Marrying 21-year-old Frances Folsom at a White House ceremony in 1886, 27 years as junior and the youngest First Lady in U.S. history, Cleveland lost his bid for a second term to Republican Benjamin Harrison, largely due to Cleveland's persistent fight to lower or eliminate protective tariffs on foreign imports. Winning the Democratic presidential nomination and later the White House in 1892, the only U.S. president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms, despite his reputation as a political reformer, his lackluster and almost bewildered response to the Panic of 1893 angered his original supporters, when the U.S. economy was crippled by a string of railroad and bank failures, a stock market crash, transportation strikes, a nationwide credit crisis, and skyrocketing unemployment that peaked at 19%. Declining the run for a third term, Cleveland retired to his estate in Princeton, New Jersey, serving as a trustee of Princeton University until his death by heart attack on June 24, 1908, where he uttered on his deathbed, "I have tried so hard to do right," making the life and achievements of Grover Cleveland a guiding influence in late 19th century American politics. The Pullman Strike of 1894. During the Panic of 1893, engineer-industrialist George Pullman laid off hundreds of workers employed by his Pullman sleeping car company, slashing wages to his remaining workforce by 30%. Furthering the hurt to his remaining employees, Pullman refused to lower rents and store prices in the company town of Pullman, some 15 miles south of downtown Chicago, obliging the entirety of his workforce to walk off their jobs in May of 1894. A month later, in a show of solidarity with Pullman workers, the American Railway Union, led by labor activist Eugene Debs, boycotted any train employing Pullman's luxury sleeping cars, effectively halting all rail traffic and commerce in 27 states west of Chicago. Officials from the General Managers Association, which represented Chicago-based railroad companies, petitioned the federal government to shut down the strike. And while labor unions were a major constituency of the Democratic Party, to show federal support of labor unions, Democratic President Grover Cleveland encouraged Congress to pass legislation in June, making the first Monday in September the legal holiday of Labor Day. The federal government's gesture failed to quell the violence that followed, when on June 29th, buildings and locomotives were set ablaze during a speech by Debs at Blue Island, Illinois, prompting U.S. Attorney General Richard Olney to seek a federal injunction against the strike and its leadership. A day later, Cleveland ordered federal troops to Chicago, despite angry protests from Illinois' pro-labor governor John Peter Altgeld, who had already ordered state militia troops to control the destructive actions of striking workers. Despite the governor's stance that Cleveland's orders were unconstitutional, on July the 6th, rioters destroyed hundreds of rail cars in South Chicago's sprawling rail depot, leading to a July 7th bloodbath when National Guardsmen opened fire on the angry mob, killing an estimated 70 strikers, while injuring 57 others. While the strike was declared over in early August, leading to Debs' arrest and 6-month imprisonment, the bloody struggle between labor and capital marked a period of rising public awareness of America's labor movement, which became a foundational element of the Progressive era, making the Pullman Strike of 1894 a major uptick in federal oversight of a nation's economic and social equity. The Progressive Era. After the excesses of the Gilded Age, muckraking journalists began to expose waste, political corruption, and scandal, at first on local levels, but as the movement grew from 1896 to 1916, progressives trickled up into state and federal politics, taking aim at problems caused by industrialization, urbanization, immigration, and political corruption. Primarily driven by the American middle class, reformers sought to expose and eradicate political machines and their crooked party bosses, believing that a higher level of direct democracy would be the end result of their house-cleaning measures. Progressives also went after corporate monopolies, resulting in federal antitrust laws that further leveled the playing field for legitimate competitors. They also pushed for higher regulations over unscrupulous manufacturers, leading to the formation of governmental oversight agencies such as the Food and Drug Administration, or FDA. But at their core, progressives were visionaries for a more modern American society, believing that scientific management practices known as Taylorisms could be applied to the most glaring inefficiencies in American society and industry, which soon made the stopwatch a symbol and watchword for industrial improvement. Many progressives supported the prohibition of alcohol, mainly to strip the power of political bosses who operated out of saloons, while others based their support on purely religious grounds. A third main theme of the Progressive era was women's suffrage, since many felt that the female vote would bring a higher purity to American politics, while a fourth theme shone a spotlight on the abuses of child labor. Progressives also transformed the social sciences by applying scientific methods to higher education, replacing so-called amateur academics with research-oriented professors who published their findings in peer-reviewed journals and presses. As the Progressive era trickled up to the national level, Republican politicians like President Teddy Roosevelt introduced his Square Deal policies, which promised fairness to the average American through trust busting, regulating railroads, and insisting on high standards in both the food and drug industries, while establishing national parks and forests for the preservation of American natural resources. Democrats also promoted progressive policies under the administration of President Woodrow Wilson, whose New Freedom platform introduced predefined legislative initiatives at the start of his first term in office, something no sitting president had ever done before, stressing conservation, bank reform, tariff reductions, and the regulation of trusts. The Progressive era ended under the weight of the First World War, re-emerging in the new era of the Roaring Twenties, until the stock market crash of 1929 and the start of the Great Depression, making the Progressive era a major turning point in the modernization of America. Eugene Debs. Born in 1855, Terre Haute, Indiana, Eugene V. Debs began his career as a railroad worker, rising up to become a clear voice in America's budding labor movement, which accelerated throughout the early decades of the 20th century. After founding the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, in 1893, Debs stepped up yet again to found the American Railway Union, or ARU, which became the most powerful American labor union of its day. A year later, Debs and the ARU initiated a successful strike against the Pullman Palace Car Company in response to wage cuts without a commensurate reduction of worker rents in the company town of Pullman, Illinois, which disrupted rail traffic in 27 states west of Chicago, giving rise to violent clashes with law enforcement, culminating in a July 7th bloodbath when National Guardsmen opened fire on protesters, killing an estimated 70 strikers while injuring 57 more. Given a 6-month sentence for violating a court injunction against the strike, while in prison, Debs became a committed socialist after studying socialist primers such as Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, going on to found the Socialist Party of America after his release from prison. During the high-water years of the Progressive Era, all at a time when conservative Americans began to fear striking workers and the socialist communist sympathies pandemic within immigrant diasporas of the early 20th century, Debs ran for president as the party's socialist candidate from 1900 to 1920, winning nearly 1 million votes during the presidential election of 1912. A staunch anti-capitalist, Debs used his fiery rhetoric to preach his belief that American workers should control the production of products during the peak years of the American Industrial Revolution, and when America entered the First World War, his many anti-war speeches landed him a 10-year prison sentence under the Sedition Act of 1918. Pardoned in 1921 by President Warren G. Harding, Debs received a hero's welcome home to Terre Haute, replete with marching bands and a crowd of some 50,000 supporters. Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Finnish socialist Karl H. Weick, Debs passed away at Lindlar Sanitarium in Elmhurst, Illinois, after years of declining health caused by his prison confinement, making the life and activism of Eugene Debs an early lodestar for left-leaning Americans. Teddy Roosevelt. Born a sickly child in 1858 New York City, as a teenager, Teddy Roosevelt took up weightlifting and gymnastics, which transformed him into a strapping young man. Graduating Harvard College in 1880, Roosevelt studied law at Columbia University before his election to the New York State Assembly at age 23, losing both his wife and his mother on the same day in 1884, escaping overwhelming grief by spending the next 2 years at his ranch in the Badlands of the Dakota Territory. Upon his return to New York, Roosevelt married his childhood sweetheart, Edith Kermit Carroll, raising 6 children over the coming years. Following an unsuccessful 1886 run for mayor of New York, President Grover Cleveland awarded Roosevelt a job at the U.S. Civil Service Commission, followed by President William McKinley's choice as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, where Roosevelt's participation with the Rough Riders made him a standout war hero following the end of the Spanish-American War, an image which won him the governor's office for the state of New York. In 1900, after campaigning as William McKinley's running mate, covering 24 states and some 21,000 miles by train, McKinley won the White House after a landslide victory over Democrats William Jennings Bryan and Adlai Stevenson. Following McKinley's assassination on September 6, 1901, 42-year-old Teddy Roosevelt transformed the public image of the presidency with his youth and vigor, becoming the first president of the Progressive Era, where he unfurled his square deal domestic program, promising to mediate between the conflicting interests of capital and labor, of isolationism and expansionism, of land conservation and development, all with the intent of stabilizing American society. Roosevelt's 2 terms in office witnessed the successful breakup of a railroad monopoly under the Sherman Antitrust Act, while mediating an equitable settlement of a coal miner strike in Pennsylvania. He also set aside some 200 million acres as protected national forests, while preserving 86 million acres of ancestral Native American lands. From a foreign policy standpoint, Roosevelt coined the motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," which he applied liberally in his dealings in Latin America, including the successful secession of Panama from Colombia, which paved the way for the construction of the Panama Canal. He also successfully meddled in affairs outside the Western Hemisphere, winning the Nobel Peace Prize for his negotiations to end the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, which included Japan's acceptance of an ongoing U.S. military presence in the Philippines. Avowing not to run for a 3rd term as president, Roosevelt formed the Progressive or Bull Moose Party in 1912 after President William Howard Taft failed to live up to his promises for progressive reforms. Shot in the chest by a fanatic would-be assassin while campaigning for president in Milwaukee, Roosevelt quickly recovered, at the same time losing his 3rd bid for the White House to Woodrow Wilson due to Roosevelt's division of Republicans during a 3-party election cycle. He passed away on January 6, 1919, after suffering a pulmonary embolism in his sleep, making Teddy Roosevelt one of the most dynamic leaders in American history. Child labor in America. During colonial times, through the first half of the 19th century, child labor was an important part of agriculture and the handicraft economies of the time, employing children on family farms or as indentured servants, while young boys entering the trades began apprenticeships by age 10 to 14. But when the Industrial Revolution in America witnessed the rise of factories, children became ideal candidates for a variety of reasons, including less wages and almost no ability to organize into labor unions. As immigration into the United States increased in the 19th and early 20th centuries, children under the age of 16 became an increasingly important resource for profit-hungry business owners, growing to 18% of the American labor force by 1900. By the mid-19th century, educational reformers began a concerted pushback against child labor practices, impressing upon the American public that proper education was a dire necessity if the nation was to prosper as a whole. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Progressive-era reformers made the end of child labor an important part of their cause, and after the National Child Labor Committee organized in 1904, reformers employed an array of tactics to increase public awareness regarding the filthy, oftentimes hazardous conditions experienced by child laborers, including investigations by experts, the use of photography to spark public outrage, persuasive congressional lobbying campaigns, and mass mailings to the public at large. A constitutional amendment was passed by Congress in 1924. However, state pushback, particularly southern states, killed any chance for ratification. The end finally came when the Great Depression left thousands of adult Americans without jobs, leading to FDR's sweeping New Deal reforms, which in effect removed children from the workforce. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act set a national minimum wage for the first time in American history, at the same time limiting worker hours and making the use of children under 16 years of age illegal in manufacturing and mining. Individual states also began increasing the number of years of schooling required for certain jobs, while lengthening the school year and strictly enforcing truancy laws, making child labor a disgraceful yet bygone era in American history. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. owned by sweatshop bosses Max Blank and Isaac Harris. The Manhattan-based Triangle Shirtwaist Company was housed in the top 3 floors of the Ash Building on the corner of Green Street and Washington Place, employing mostly young immigrant women who worked 12-hour days, 7 days a week, all for the abusively meager pay of $15 per week. With a long history of suspicious fires in their other factories, potentially set to collect on large fire insurance policies, Blank and Harris went out of their way to resist fire safety measures at their Triangle Shirtwaist Company in case they needed another revenue-generating fire. Of the 4 elevators accessing the factory floors, only one was operational, and of the 2 stairways down to the street, one was locked from the outside to prevent theft, while the other stairway door opened inward. On Saturday afternoon, March 25, 1911, 600 workers were crammed into their sewing stations when a fire broke out in a rag bin. A manager attempted to put it out, only to discover that the fire hose had rotted while the valve was rusted shut. Panic ensued as a long line of workers queued before an elevator that held only 12 passengers at a time. When it broke down amidst the heat and flames, terrified workers plunged down the shaft to their deaths. Others fled down the stairwells, only to burn to death when they reached the inoperable outside doors. Others jumped to their death from inadequate fire escapes, falling on fire hoses that made it difficult for firefighters to fight the flames. Within 18 minutes, the fire was over, leaving 146 innocent workers dead, while Blank and Harris and other top management escaped to the rooftop and jumped to safety on the roofs of adjoining buildings. In the wake of the tragedy, protests over worker conditions resulted in an April 5th march on New York's Fifth Avenue, with more than 80,000 in attendance, while city officials passed the Sullivan-Hoey Fire Prevention Law, which called for massive changes to workplace fire prevention measures, and while Blank and Harris were brought up on manslaughter charges in the face of overwhelming evidence of neglect, they were ultimately acquitted by a grand jury. To settle the many lawsuits against them, Blank and Harris eventually paid out compensation to the victims' families of $75 per life lost, a mere fraction of the $400 per death settlement they received from their insurance company, making the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire an early wake-up call for union organizers throughout the United States. The Bread and Roses Strike. When the state of Massachusetts reduced maximum work week hours for women and children from 56 to 54, impoverished textile workers in Lawrence saw their average pay drop from $8.76 per week to $8.44, a difference that left many with the hard choice between eating a meal or going hungry. Known as Immigrant City, due to the town's melting pot diaspora of residents from 51 nations, after female and child workers at the Everett Mill walked off their jobs, when the news reached the city's wretched tenements that evening, by January 12, 1912, more than 10,000 workers had walked off their jobs in solidarity, protesting in frigid conditions with the communal cry of short pay, all out, and the ultimate call for dignity, we want bread and roses too. After their numbers continued to swell, some strikers began vandalizing the textile mills of Lawrence, prompting police and state militia to beat back the most aggressive offenders with billy clubs. Lacking even a hint of common culture or language, the Bread and Roses strike went viral in newspapers across the country, as journalists reported on how the ethnically diverse strikers employed soup kitchens, ethnic fraternities, community centers, and food donations by local farmers to feed their striking masses. After mill owners and city officials hired outside agitators to discredit the strikers in the court of public opinion, on January 29th, strikers attacked a streetcar carrying strikebreakers, resulting in an errant shotgun blast that led to the death of Anna Lopezzo, followed a day later by 18-year-old John Ramey after he was bayoneted in the shoulder by a militiaman. The violence led to what became a publicity coup known as the Children's Exodus, when striking parents sent 119 children to live with relatives and total strangers in Manhattan, while a second group of 46 children bound for Philadelphia met with violence when police in Lawrence dragged striking mothers by their hair as their traumatized children looked on. The horrendous optics in the national press led to hearings on Capitol Hill, shedding light on deplorable working conditions inside Lawrence mills, where respiratory infections caused by lint and dust revealed an average worker lifespan of 40 years. 14-year-old Carmelo Tioli shocked lawmakers when she recounted how a mill machine tore off her scalp, leaving her hospitalized for 7 months. Forced to capitulate under mounting outside pressure, mill owners agreed to a 15% wage hike, increased overtime pay, and a promise not to retaliate against strikers, making the Bread and Roses strike a landmark event in the American labor movement. Woodrow Wilson. Born in 1856 Virginia, Woodrow Wilson graduated Princeton in 1879 before attending UVA Law School, followed by a PhD from Johns Hopkins, before teaching jurisprudence and politics at Bryn Mawr, Wesleyan, and Princeton, becoming the 13th president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910. During his time as an educator, he also published the 5-volume History of the American People, which romanticized both the Confederacy and the Ku Klux Klan, before winning the New Jersey governor's office in 1910, where he captured national attention as a progressive reformer. At age 56, Wilson won the White House in 1912 in a landslide election over a divided Republican Party, becoming the last American president to arrive at his inauguration in a horse-drawn carriage. During his first term in office, Wilson's progressive reforms included the Underwood-Simmons Act, which reduced tariffs on imports while imposing a new federal income tax. He also established the Federal Reserve to provide oversight over the nation's banking system and money supply, as well as the establishment of the Federal Trade Commission for the policing of unfair business practices. He also led the push for child labor laws, while establishing an 8-hour workday for railroad employees and a system of government loans for farmers. On the downside, however, he reversed hard-fought gains for African Americans by resegregating a number of federal agencies, effectively undoing important gains in racial equality since post-Civil War Reconstruction. Winning a second term by a narrow electoral margin, Wilson's campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," ended in early 1917, when Germany began the systematic sinking of U.S. merchant ships. When U.S. officials learned about the Zimmermann telegram, which exposed Germany's plot to draw Mexico into World War I on the side of Germany in exchange for land ceded to the U.S. after the Mexican-American War, on April 2, 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, a decision which ultimately hastened the end of the First World War. In a January 1918 speech to Congress, Wilson outlined his 14 points to prevent future world wars, proposing a League of Nations to arbitrate international disputes between nations. A year later, he helped to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles at the Paris Peace Conference, which placed untenable reparations on Germany and ultimately led to the Second World War. His second term also saw the ratification of the Volstead Act, which brought prohibition to America on January 17, 1920, as well as passage of the 19th Amendment that same year, which gave women the right to vote. Leaving office in March of 1921, he passed away at his Washington, D.C. home on February 3, 1924, making the life and public policies of Woodrow Wilson a productive yet complex figure in 20th century history. Woodrow Wilson's racist policies. While Woodrow Wilson was lauded by most Americans for his leadership during the First World War, as well as his progressive reforms for American business and labor, his upbringing in antebellum Virginia tainted his views on race and segregation, which followed him all the way to the White House. For instance, in his 5-volume history series, A History of the American People, his written views on the institution of slavery adheres to what historians have called a lost cause narrative of the antebellum South, insisting that slavery was a gentle patrician affair, while recasting the Civil War as an issue of states' rights instead of slavery. His recorded views on post-Civil War Reconstruction further illuminate his racist bent, insisting that Reconstruction placed Southern white men under the intolerable burden of governments sustained by the votes of ignorant Negroes, while casting the Ku Klux Klan as an invisible empire of the South, bound together in loose organization to protect the Southern country from some of the ugliest hazards of a time of revolution. When Wilson entered the White House in 1913, he allowed the Southern members of his cabinet to segregate the Treasury, the Post Office, the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, the Navy, the Interior, the Marine Hospital, the War Department, and the Government Printing Office, forcing the creation of separate offices, lunchrooms, and bathrooms for black federal employees, at the same time crushing whatever gains African Americans had made since the end of the Civil War. In a surviving transcript regarding an Oval Office meeting with civil rights activists Webb Du Bois and William Monroe Trotter, whom Wilson angrily threw out of his office in 1914, Wilson argued that segregation is not humiliating, but a benefit, and ought to be so regarded by you gentlemen. Since Wilson's racist views have surfaced, institutions and politicians have grappled with his legacy, prompting Monmouth University officials in June of 2020 to announce their intentions to rename Woodrow Wilson Hall, while after years of protests, Princeton University plans to remove Wilson's name from its prestigious public policy school, announcing that his segregationist sympathies and policies made Wilson an especially inappropriate namesake, making the racist policies of Woodrow Wilson a backsliding disappointment for racial equality in early 20th century America. Wilsonianism. As the horrors of World War I approached its final months of bloody conflict, taking the lives of some 40 million people, on January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson outlined his now famous 14 points as a basis for ending the war while promoting world peace for future generations. Woven into his 14 points was a call for democracy instead of authoritarian rule, the later, Wilson believed, contributing greatly to the outbreak of the First World War. He also called for conflict resolution bodies such as the League of Nations and the United Nations, as well as an emphasis on the spread of capitalism and self-determination among nation-states. Wilson also called for collective security by means of a new sense of liberal internationalism instead of isolationism, including freedom of the seas, open borders, and an end to secret treaties between nations. In his own words, Wilson advocated for the General Association of Nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike, and in a later speech to Congress, that national aspirations must be respected while allowing people around the world to be governed by their own consent. Wilson's 14 points launched an intense wave of optimism within colonial-ruled nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, elevating Wilson to an almost godlike figurehead in colonial-ruled states around the world, prompting Indian nationalist Ganesh Shankar Vijayarthi to hail Wilson as the modern apostle of freedom. Optimism within colonial-ruled nations proved short-lived, however, when the June 28, 1919 signing of the Treaty of Versailles failed to end colonial rule of First World countries over Third World nations, descending citizens of marginalized countries into a communal state of disillusionment and continued despair. Some historians have suggested that not only did the punitive demands the treaty placed on Germany lead directly to the Second World War, but the treaty's complete rejection of Wilsonianism, as Wilson's 14 points are known today, led to a number of protest movements in colonial-ruled nations, including the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance movement in India, the March 1st movement in Korea, and China's 1919 May 4th movement, making Woodrow Wilson's 14 points a telling missed opportunity for world peace. The Great Steel Strike of 1919. In the lead-up to America's entry into the First World War, a sense of nationalism stoked tensions within the immigrant diaspora of most industrialized regions of the United States, and after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 toppled the reign of Tsar Nicholas II in lieu of socialist leaders like Vladimir Lenin, anxious Americans cast a suspicious eye upon labor unions, immigrants in general, African Americans, and the worry over the spread of homegrown socialism. As the nation's entry into the war caused labor shortages as able-bodied American men took up arms instead of shovels, labor unions, the federal government, and industrial employers became odd bedfellows under the guise of the War Labor Board, so chartered to fend off labor strikes through active mediation, which in turn witnessed a marked increase in worker pay, while daily work hours dropped from 12 to 8. That all ended following Armistice Day on November 11, 1918, when American industrial giants like U.S. Steel, the nation's largest employer, reinstated the 12-hour workday and refused to acknowledge labor unions. Still merged with the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers since the outbreak of war, the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, dragged their feet against demands by some 23 different craft unions to call a strike. And after union members began to abandon their union affiliations, on September 22nd, the Great Strike of 1919 began when half of the nation's steel workers, some 350,000, walked off their jobs in 6 states, creating a domino effect in a number of different industries that eventually saw 1/5 of the nation's labor force walk off their jobs. Companies soon took matters into their own hands, using the media to paint fears of a rising tide of homegrown socialism, ethnic tension between immigrant populations, and all-out racial bias against African Americans, leading to an uptick in the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 that painted strikers as opportunistic socialists. They also tried to turn native-born workers against immigrant workers, while newspapers fed their readerships with rumors of Russian gold supporting the American labor movement. The backdraft of negative public opinion intensified when Big Steel hired African American strikebreakers, leading to deadly race riots in Gary, Indiana, Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., and 23 other American cities. As labor unions took a beating in the court of public opinion, striking workers began to cross their own picket lines in defeat, leading to the strike's conclusion on January 8, 1920, making the Great Steel Strike of 1919 a most turbulent time in American history. The Red Summer of 1919. The summer of 1919 marked a breaking point behind the ever-rising tensions surrounding the migration during World War I of African Americans from their southern homes to cities in the North and Midwest. Once the war was over, thousands of white soldiers returned home to find their factory jobs filled by previously Southern blacks. Combined with an economic slump in post-war America, tensions snapped between whites and blacks over increased competition in both the jobs and housing markets, causing an outbreak of largely white-on-black rioting to break out simultaneously in many American cities. During the summer of 1919, riots across the U.S. would break out in cities like Washington, D.C., Knoxville, Tennessee, Omaha, Nebraska, and more than 36 other American cities. None, though, was as dramatic as the events that occurred in Chicago. On July 27, 1919, African-American Eugene Williams had gone with some friends to swim at their local beach. In the midst of having fun, Eugene inadvertently crossed the line that separated the white and black sides of the beach, prompting a group of white men to stone Eugene before he could safely return to the black side of the line. Eugene was struck in the head and subsequently drowned, and when the police arrived on scene to collect accounts by several eyewitnesses, the officers refused to arrest the white men responsible for Eugene's death, instead arresting a black man for no logical or apparent reason. Before the day was over, white and black mobs had mobilized throughout the city, rioting for the next 5 days until local and federal authorities called in 6,000 National Guardsmen and infantry in an effort to restore order. The Guardsmen were positioned around the black belts of Chicago to curtail any further attacks by whites. By the time the violence had ended, 38 people were dead, most of them African American, along with 537 injuries. Many African Americans fled back to their southern homes during the violence, while 1,000 mostly African American citizens would be left homeless due to arson attacks. While racial fighting during the Red Summer was contained mainly to northern and midwestern cities, the highest number of fatalities occurred in the rural areas surrounding Elaine, Arkansas, where an estimated 240 African Americans and 5 whites lost their lives to uncontrolled rioting and hate. And there you have it, the Progressive Era, today on the Daily Dose. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.